Steven, you think people will be upset it doesn't have that one feature we thought it would have?
Sounds so rehearsed.
You know what? F you, Steven. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is the official preview of the Canon 1DX Mark III. I didn't make sure that it's 3. Now this just might be the greatest professional sports action DSLR in the history of DSLRs. It's probably going to be the last greatest of ever, but there's a lot of specs to get into, so let's jump right in with a 20.1 megapixel all-new CMOS full-frame sensor that has a new low-pass filter that's supposed to mimic having no low-pass filter. But Steven, the funny thing about that is, you know what? You know what's better than having a low-pass filter mimic a low-pass filter? Not actually having a low-pass filter. That's right there. Oh, guess what this camera doesn't have? IBIS. So many people thought that we would see Canon have a DSLR with IBIS, and this camera does not have IBIS, which leads me to believe that the Nikon D6 will also not have IBIS. I know a lot of people think they should be working on the technology for DSLRs. They should actually be working on the technology for their mirrorless cameras, because we know that Canon currently doesn't have IBIS in mirrorless cameras. Now, there is a new Digic. What do you call this? Steven, what is this? What does this look like to you?
X.
It's an X. So Canon wants us to call it the X, not the 10. So we will go ahead and call it a new Digic 10 processor that is 3 times faster than the 2 Digic 6 Plus processors in the Mark II. So now it has one faster processor that's the X gonna give it to you. X gonna, anyway, the ISO range is 100 to 102,400. It can expand all the way up to 819,200. Now this is one stop better than the old 1DX Mark II. Now Canon is saying that between 6400 ISO and 12,800, you're gonna see the best improvement of the noise, and you're gonna get cleaner images there than prior. This is also one stop better than what the Sony A9 II is capable of, because that only goes up to 50,800 or something along those lines. So this is already one stop better. But the A9 II is a 24 megapixel sensor. Some people will be upset that the Canon is only a 20.1 megapixel sensor, but I don't really care. In the 20 megapixel range, that's perfectly enough. In terms of autofocusing points, you now have 191 point AF system, with 155 of them being cross type. It's like a plus, it's not an X, it's taken it. So there's 155 cross type autofocusing points with 191 total that are all clumped into the middle, just like DSLRs like to do. They clump them into the middle. It's the same exact size as you had in the 1DX Mark II, so there's just more of them, and I guess more cross type. Now there is something new that Canon pointed out, and they said that it has head and face tracking using deep learning. Now is that like 3D tracking that Nikon used to have or currently has in their DSLRs? Because it's certainly not IAF, because it's using a much smaller sensor in order to process all of that information. So maybe it just has some new algorithms to work with because it has deep learning, not to be confused with AI, because that's Allen Iverson. He has nothing to do with Canon. This camera is blazing fast at 16 frames a second with the mechanical shutter, with full autofocus for those 16 frames a second with very little blackout. There can't be a lot of blackout because you're shooting 16 frames a second. You just have to make sure that your shutter speed is actually fast enough to allow you to get 16 frames a second, because if you try to get 16 frames a second at 1/10 of a second, it's not gonna happen, because that would be well over a second. Now this is interesting. In live view, with the mirror flipped out of the way, this camera becomes a mirrorless camera that can do 20 frames per second in the silent mode, but can also do 20 frames per second with a mechanical shutter, with autofocus and auto exposure continuously happening throughout the entire time you're shooting. But because this is a DSLR with the mirror flipped out of the way, the OVF becomes useless, because you can't look through it, which means you have no EVF, which means you are now using the LCD on the back of the screen to shoot photos silently or with the mechanical shutter if you need it in certain lighting situations with LED lights. What professional photographer in the sporting world have you ever seen hold a camera out like this and use an LCD to shoot? I haven't seen any, Steven. I haven't seen any. And I hope I never will, because I will walk up to them and be like, what are you doing? You blew it. So there's no EVF, but 20 frames per second mechanical with the mirror locked up and 20 frames per second electronic, that is a sign of things to come. Because of that, IAF is active at 20 frames per second. In live view, that's pretty good. So you also have full tracking with the mechanical shutter as well. Think about it. What is the future holding for Canon? Maybe in this camera right here. Speaking of live view, you have updated dual pixel autofocus in this camera. Now, Canon is telling us there is 3,869 autofocusing points that are manually selectable, or whatever. That's very similar to what they said about the EOS R with 5,000 and some focusing points that you'll never see or never notice. You can select 525 of them. That's it. Well, when I say that's it, that's actually a lot. You pretty much have 90% viewfinder coverage. When I say viewfinder, I mean LCD coverage, because you don't have an actual viewfinder when the mirror's flipped up, but you will cover roughly 90%, all the way to the top, all the way to the bottom, just a little bit to the left and just a little bit to the right will be off. Let me cut in here real quick and let you know that I just announced the super huge mega camera giveaway. That's right, I'll be giving one of you a free camera or lenses valued up to $3,499. Now, it's completely free to enter this contest. Head on over to bit.ly/megafro2020 for all of the contest rules and to get your entries in. But I do want to let you know, if you purchase FroPack 1 or FroPack 2, you will get bonus entries. And if you already purchased FroPack 1 or FroPack 2, you are already entered. Now, let's get back to the video. The 1DX Mark III is one of the first cameras to implement dual CF Express card slots. These are the future. They are super fast, they're not super expensive, and hopefully they are super reliable. Now, Canon says that you can do 1,000 plus RAW plus JPEG files without ever outrunning this camera. Now, that is something that Sony should think about, because with their SD cards, I take pictures and then I sit there and I'm like, oh, look, they're still writing to the card. And then like 3 minutes later, hey, look, it's still writing to the card. Why? Because they're still using SD cards. I'm gonna get to more of that in just a minute, but these dual CF Express cards, this is what everything should be. You can expect to see that in the D6 from Nikon as well. Now, there's a new smart controller button on the back. Remember on the EOS R, they pushed this touch panel thing that was really stupid? And I said to Steven at the time, it would be better just to give me a square touchpad that I can just move my thumb around to move the focusing points. Then I don't have to use touch to drag AF on the screen. I don't have to use the joystick. I have this digital D-pad, which is very similar to a Super Nintendo controller I once had that had this, it was like a yellow controller and you would just put your thumb over it and it didn't actually move, but it used the sensor technology to move the hockey player around the ice. I didn't get it. I just kept trying to push it. I was like, I don't get it. It's not working well. But this is a button at the top of the camera, on the back, right where your thumb goes. It also activates the back button autofocus if you're a back button focus shooter, which I'm still not, and I don't think I ever will be. But when you go vertical, you also have the same button there. So this should allow you to more pinpointly move your autofocusing points right with this sensor. I hear from people that have used it that it works extremely well. And by that, I really mean like one person that's used it, Steven. Now let's get into the video specs. You have 10-bit 422 4K 60p with Canon log. You also have 5.5K recording in 12-bit RAW that is recorded internal to the CF Express cards. You are chewing up so much data here, but the cards are capable of receiving all of that from the camera. Now, this might upset some video shooters who want to use the LCD screen to shoot. There are no zebra lines. There's also no EVF, as we've already said. So you're gonna have to plug in an external monitor or use a Zacuto or use something on the back of the screen, or hold it out and use it. But you don't have zebra lines, which some people, like Steven off to my right here, like using zebra lines because you can't rely on the LCD screen's brightness to determine whether everything is exposed properly when you're shooting the video. The one thing I do need to mention, because you're probably asking, is it full frame? Yes, it's full frame 4K. It's also full frame 5.5K. The 4K is oversampled from the 5.5K, which should make this video footage much sharper than any other EOS camera to date. Now, of course, Canon still had to leave something out, and that is there is no 1080p at 24 frames per second at launch. They are saying there will be a firmware update at some point which will bring you that. Is that big of a deal, Steven? No, not really, because you have 4K that you can do. But you know what is a big deal, Steven? What? There is no AF in full frame 4K or 5.5K at 60 frames per second. That means no AF, like the autofocus is useless at 60 frames per second going full frame in 4K and 5.5K. But what it does have is if you go into crop mode, you can get 4K in crop mode at 60 frames per second with full autofocus. So as usual, there are some limitations with Canon specs in this camera that you could expect to see in other cameras, and hopefully they'll update most of these with firmware. Now, if they don't, they don't, because this camera's primary focus is really for those sports and action shooters and newspaper shooters. But I guess if you have a nice camera that can do video, maybe people will go ahead and look at it. Now, will you just look at it, Steven? Will you look at the next spec on the sheet? It says there's no audio in 1080 at 120 frames per second. I don't know why. Nikon does it, Sony does it, Canon, they don't do it. This camera has Wi-Fi built in along with Bluetooth and GPS. You can also get another external adapter for Wi-Fi to make it even better and give you more control. That's something that the pros would use when they're shooting the Super Bowl or when they're in situations where they need to wire the images back. There are other wireless transmitters that you can get to plug into this camera. Something that Steven's been asking for and a lot of Canon shooters have been asking for are back illuminated buttons in the camera. They finally went ahead and did that. Catching up 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, they finally have back illuminated buttons, which do come in handy when you're shooting concerts or in dark situations. There is a 2.1 million dot full touchscreen LCD on the back of the camera that does not articulate, it does not rotate, and I don't care that it doesn't do any of that because that is pretty useless in most situations. This camera is built Ford tough. Actually, let's rephrase that. It is built Cybertruck tough. You could throw a ball at it and maybe it won't break. But we'll just say Cyber Tough Truck. This is a weather-sealed, super tough camera that is actually 90 grams lighter than the older 1DX Mark II. So it's the same form factor, the same body. They built it stronger, but it's lighter. That's a bonus. Here's something that we already knew at announcement, but I do want to point it out that if you are a JPEG shooter and you don't want to shoot RAW because you think you need the extra speed, whatever, or you should be shooting RAW no matter what. But if you want something better than JPEG, you now have a 10-bit HEIF file that has better quality because it's 10-bit instead of 8-bit. So you might as well start shooting HEIF if you are shooting JPEGs. You could do both. You could do RAW plus HEIF. You could do JPEG plus HEIF. Whatever you decide to do, just always shoot RAW because that's my motto. So Jared, when does it come out? Steven, do you know when it comes out?
When?
Sometime in February for the low price of $1,000 more than the 1DX Mark II, which puts this camera at $6,500, which is awfully expensive. But for the people that need it and want it, they will spend the extra $1,000 to get this camera. Now that makes me wonder, will the Nikon camera be $7,000? Because it's usually more expensive than the Canons. But keep in mind that Sony's A9 II is $4,500. With the grip, it's about $4,800, but it's still under $5,000. Now, with that being said, that is an older camera. Let me cut in here real quick and let you know that the images that you're seeing on the screen right now were taken with the Canon 1DX Mark II and edited using FroPack 2. Now, if you're looking to speed up your RAW workflow or give yourself a great starting point, we created 15 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can play with at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack2. Over there, you'll find the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you like them, they are currently 40% off for FroPack 2, or if you'd like to get FroPack 2 and FroPack 1 as a bundle, you can save even more. So now, let's get back to the video. Now let's think about it, guys. This is a hybrid wannabe mirrorless camera. It can't be a true mirrorless camera right now because when you flip the mirror up, you do not have an EVF. But let's think about this logically. If they have all of this technology for mirrorless cameras in a DSLR today, this is the proving ground for having a professional mirrorless camera in the future for Canon. They have a 20 megapixel sensor, brand new. It shoots 20 frames per second in the electronic mode and 20 frames per second with the mechanical shutter without a mirror. This is the future of where Canon is going with a mirrorless camera. But when will it come out? We're looking at something like, if I had to guess, no less than 2 years before Canon can get a pro high-end mirrorless camera with these type of specs. Now, the Sony A9 came out almost 3 years ago at this point, and they just came out with the A9 II. It has a 24 megapixel sensor. It's a smaller body that isn't built as Ford tough or isn't built as Cybertruck tough as the Canon or as the Nikon is going to be. So this is a warning to Sony that you have a jump start for now. You have a jump start. Now, what I think Sony needs to do to compete with their next body that comes out, it's going to be a couple more megapixels in the Pro, we're talking sports camera A9 III when that comes. We need to see a bigger built body with CF Express cards. Japan has to get through their minds that it's not about just miniaturizing everything, it's about putting the right technology into the camera, and the right technologies are the CF Express cards and a bigger body with a built-in grip that just is built much better. So that's what I have to say right there. That is a long preview of the 1DX Mark III. We will get our hands on one as soon as they come out to give it a real-world review and try to see how it works in these hands right here. These hands, my hands, because we'll actually have to get some glass for it, because right now we just have mostly RF glass and a couple of EF lenses. So what do you guys think about this camera? Were you waiting for it? Are you disappointed? Do you care that it's $6,500 and not $5,500? Let me know down below, and that is where I'll leave it. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.